Okay, are we ready, everybody? So I don't know about, I'm a little tired from today. Just a low energy day, I feel like. And I imagine a lot of you feel that way, working, doing whatever you do. I want us to remember that we're talking about the most important things that ever happened. So let's try to gather ourselves and help each other to learn about this. And we are officially starting, we talked a little bit about it Sunday, but we're officially starting fact number 3. And there's a new handout. Does anybody need one? Fact number 3. Joyce? Andrew, can you grab a couple? I expect better from you.
Disappointed dad over
Okay. So number 1, we talked about the fact that Jesus is real. 2, we talked about that Jesus was crucified by the Romans. Subtitles are not available. I got a mom look from Salem, so with Aaron. I'm talking how I usually talk with these, so. All right, maybe I was just not close enough.
It doesn't normally say listening. It normally comes.
Yeah, right at the beginning. But usually it's picking up you guys too, so we might just be having a glitch, which will be fine. I'll try to speak up and repeat what people say. What was I talking about? Does anybody remember?
No.
Fact number 1 and fact number 2.
Okay, thank you. So fact number 1, we discussed the universal acceptance that Jesus was a real person. 2, we discussed that the consensus of he actually was crucified by the Romans. And then fact number 3 that we're going to start talking about is that the disciples, and when we say disciples in this one, we're really talking mostly about the 12, but not just the 12, but all of those who were following at the beginning, that they actually, truly, really, sincerely believed that they saw Jesus alive again. Like we said, we're talking about the base facts that anyone can agree with. And once we're done with that and looking at these facts and why they're so universal, we'll ask, what's the best explanation for this information? And you all know where that's going. But we'll look at that, and then we'll look at objections to that answer and some of the alternative theories that there are out there. And then we'll reflect, and that's what the class is going to be. But the disciples sincerely believed that they saw Jesus again. And where we're pulling this from is, if you remember our base text for the whole class, 1 Corinthians 15, starting at the beginning of the chapter, but really 3 through 8, that Paul says, this is what I received myself, this is what I taught you, and this is the core of the gospel. And when we did all of our historical work, we said that what Paul is repeating in verses really 3 through 5 can be traced, based on what we know, benchmarks of history, to within 10 years of Jesus dying and being raised. And so this is really the earliest material probably that we have in the New Testament about what was being taught by the original disciples. And so we might have said on Sunday, but what did Josephus and Tacitus both say happened after Jesus was executed?
That those who followed him did not go away, but they followed him.
Right. Right. I think the way that Josephus puts it is those who loved him did not stop, or something to that effect, but all the more. And Tacitus says he received the extreme penalty, but we thought it was checked, and then it spread everywhere, including to Rome. So something happened there. Even if we don't have the biblical record, this man was executed just like they did with all the rest of those guys. But they're noting something about it because this was different. Something different happened here. And what happened here was people were still talking about it even after he was gone, which had not happened. And so this is what we're talking about. His followers didn't disappear, but instead they start publicly proclaiming this guy is actually risen from the dead. We saw him, we talked to him, we spent time with him. And this is what we're talking about in this fact, this really kind of earth-shattering thing. And so I want to say this, I think I said it before, what we're talking about with fact number 3 and what we'll talk about with fact number 4, which is we're going to look at Paul by himself, this is probably the most important information that we're going to talk about. Because this is where everything started. Jesus was real. He said what he said. He was killed. But where everything started was the fact that the disciples said, no, he's alive again. We saw him. And so we could say, as I said in that last paragraph in the introduction, this is where Christianity started, was the disciples making this claim. And so you know kind of the general story of Scripture and what happens with them and all that they do. And in trying to understand that the disciples really believed this, what would we want to look at? If we're trying to decide, did the disciples actually believe this or not, how might we go about deciding if that was true? The answer is in front of you on the papers, but I'm not going to tell you what the answer is yet. So if you were going to do this and decide, did they actually believe that, what would you look at?
What they said.
Look at what they said, what they wrote, and then what they did, right? Try to go back to their own mouths and see, do we have anything that shows, yeah, this is what they really said, this is what they really did. And then going back to that, what does that say about the truth of their belief here? But that's what we're going to look at then. What did they say? And what they said is really contained within this traditional material in 1 Corinthians 15. Then we're going to look at what did they do, their lives and how their lives ended up. And then we're going to try to talk about, so where did this come from then? You know, this unprecedented, never before heard thing, where did this come from? Did they make it up somehow? Is there some other way to explain this belief popping up? And that's what we're discussing. So let's all turn to 1 Corinthians 15. As I said, really this class is just unpacking what Paul says here in these verses. So 1 Corinthians 15, and can I get a volunteer to read verses 3 through 8? 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8. Okay, Aaron's got it.
For I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received, that Christ died for our sins in accordance with Scripture, that he was buried and that he was raised on the third day in accordance with the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, then to the 12, then he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time, most of whom are still alive, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, and then to all the apostles. Last of all, as to one untimely born, he appeared also to me.
Okay, thanks, Aaron. So what does Paul spend the most time talking about in these verses? What does he address?
Who all Jesus went to see.
Right, he addresses who Jesus went to see. That is what takes up most of what we just read in this traditional core material, is all of these different appearances. And so my version, for instance, has appearances, but if you have the King James or the New King James, another way to render this appeared, and I think maybe it's a little bit better, gets the point across, is that it says that he was seen by Peter, and he was seen by James, and so on and so forth. This was not just some kind of odd manifestation, but it goes back to their actual experience that they saw him. And I think the King James tradition gets that well. So what we're going to talk about is this, really, tonight. We're going to go through all of these appearances that are listed and discuss them and, their reliability and so forth, what we can learn from it. But Paul spends most of his time talking about this. So apparently, this is really important. And you could say, based on the time that he takes in talking about it, that it might be the most important thing that he talks about, like we said.
It's interesting the way he goes about that. And in sales and marketing, I mean, this is called social proof. If I want to convince you of something, I try to connect it to people that you know.
Right.
You know, that's why 4 out of 5 dentists say this.
I've never met any of those dentists.
I haven't either.
Yeah.
You know, there's a sign going down 31 on the way to work. 9 out of 10 dogs, you know, recommend this veterinarian clinic. And so you have social proof. And so he says that, you know, this happened, and he was seen by all these people, 500 at one time, most of whom are still alive. And you probably can know one. You probably know someone that saw Jesus alive.
Mhm.
So I mean, this is social proof, because the easiest way to get somebody to accept something or believe something is to get them to relate to someone that says, yeah, I know that's true.
Yeah, I would state that maybe also connecting it to their real life. You know, in doing this and what Paul is talking about, and we could back it up and say, you know, what is Paul talking about 1 Corinthians 15? But he's connecting the reality of the resurrection of Jesus to say, no, this is not an abstract concept. This is something that really happened, and here are the witnesses, and you can talk to them. Andrew.
And more than it just being an abstract majority or number of people that he's appealing to, because that alone, just appealing to, well, lots of people believe this, that's not really a way to prove anything. In fact, it's a category of logical fallacy to just say, well, lots of people believe it, lots of people agree with me.
Yeah.
But I think included in the statement when he talks about the 500, most of whom are still alive, he says. So this reads to me as an invitation to check against the eyewitness account of others and to compare to, there are many you can talk to who are still living who saw this with their own eyes. So it's not as much an appeal to majority or an appeal to the crowd, but it's, you know, test for yourselves. Here's a list of names of people you can go to.
Yeah, absolutely. And we will talk about some of that more. Probably not tonight, but in future classes. Let's start looking at what did they say. So Paul lists all of these witnesses. Most of them go back, obviously, to the original disciples. And the question is, okay, if we want to know whether they really, truly believe this, what did they say? So can you think of, if we're trying to figure out what did the disciples originally say, what would be our source material that we would go to try to find that? And let's not just say the Bible. Let's try to break it down a little bit more. What kinds of writings, for instance, do we have in the Bible? Any guesses? Andrew.
I mean, in Paul's letters, you have words from Paul himself, who was numbered as an apostle.
Right.
And in the Gospels, you have accounts that are, they self-admit that they're told from the standpoint of eyewitnesses. Is what
Okay.
they claim to be.
Absolutely. So let's take a few minutes to talk about both of those. So that's part of the core material that we have, obviously, in looking at what the disciples said. So Andrew brought up Paul in his letters. Why is Paul an important source for understanding what the original disciples claimed and believed?
He wasn't one of the 12 that lived with Jesus.
Right. So he wasn't one of the originals. How does he connect then to the rest of them? Brace, you're looking.
Yeah, I mean, even more significant than the fact that he wasn't one of the original 12 is that he was an opponent to the cause, to the way, and everything about Jesus, because he believed that he was an imposter and that he was against the things of God.
Right. Yeah, and so that's an important thing about Paul also. So he wasn't part of the 12. He was an enemy before. But did Paul read this stuff in the verses that we just read? Did he read that on a billboard somewhere? You know, how did he come about this information?
From Scripture.
I don't think it was from Scripture, because remember, they themselves are writing this.
He saw it.
Inspiration of God.
Inspiration of God. What did you say, Andrew?
He saw it for himself.
He saw it for himself, and as we've talked about, he goes and talks to these people.
He learned it from the apostles.
Yeah, he goes to Jerusalem multiple times. For instance, in the first chapter of Galatians, he says, I go to Jerusalem to talk specifically to Peter and to talk to James, the Lord's brother. I didn't bother talking with anyone else. And lo and behold, who's mentioned by name in this tradition here? Those two guys. And so part of it is Paul is repeating because he knows them personally. He was acquaintances, friends, co-workers, however you want to put it, co-apostles with these men. And he's saying this is what they said, this is what they believed. So that's why Paul is an important source, obviously. Okay, so then the next thing that was said is the Gospels are an important source for what the disciples said, what they actually believed. Why are the Gospels an important source for that? Andrew again.
I mean, aren't the Gospels some of the last books chronologically that were written to be added to the New Testament? The way
Yeah.
I see them is essentially the Gospels are the written record of the testimony that the apostles would have told Paul. The Gospels were their story that they told when they taught people and converted people. And before the apostles themselves reached the end of their lives, they made an effort to write those down and have it be recorded.
Yeah, so the Gospels, they go back to the apostles, those original disciples. And like was said, they're some of the later books that were actually written, if you look at when everything is dated, which is confusing because we have them first. But remember, the New Testament's not laid out chronologically. It's actually laid out mostly by size, big to small in some ways. But it was written later, and if you look kind of at history, it's when the apostles start to die off, is when a lot of these are written down. The Gospels come about when the apostles begin to die, or they're spread off to other places. And like was being said, part of that is to keep a record of their testimony for the other churches and for the disciples who did not know them and did not receive that before. Greg.
Luke wrote that there were many attempts at writing down the testimony that had been given regarding the things that had been done in our presence.
Right.
And he says, I just thought it was a good idea to put it all in consecutive order. But also, I have thoroughly investigated everything that's been written before since the beginning. So Luke admits to the fact that he's approaching these other documents that have begun to circulate with a critical eye to make sure that everything could be substantiated, and then he was going to filter that if necessary to come up with a true single chronological record of what Jesus did on the earth.
Right. And if you don't know what Greg's referring to, that's Luke chapter 1, the first few verses, if you want to look at that. Yeah, there were other Gospels written before the ones that we have. They weren't called that. They probably weren't in the same scope, but there were written and a lot of times oral traditions and materials being circulated around. And Luke says, yeah, I investigated all of these. A lot of people have tried to talk about this. And so we have this record because it goes back to the apostles, and it was to preserve what they said before they were not around any longer to teach it. And so that's really important. Can you think of other sources for what the earliest disciples believed? There's another one that's in the New Testament, and 1 Corinthians 15 is an example of that type of thing. So what kind of thing did we say 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 8 was? Did Paul write it? Or what does he say? He received it. So this is traditional material that was already being circulated. And there are other aspects of that in the New Testament too. And I'm not going to get into all the details, but there are some places, for instance, where it seems like Paul is repeating a hymn that the early Christians sang. So if you want to look at this later, for example, a lot of people think part of Philippians chapter 2 was actually a hymn that Paul is repeating. What about the book of Acts? How would that be a source for what the earliest disciples believed and taught? I'm thinking of Acts 2, Acts 4, Acts 13, 17, examples like that. Yeah, go ahead.
Or you mean just, we know that there was sermons and teaching being done in their presence, not all of which is recorded word for word in a scriptural form, but there were even men like Apollos who were teaching, and we don't know anything he said, but there were other teachers active.
Okay. Yeah, so there is a record of that teaching. What I'm referring to specifically is the sermons by the apostles. So Peter on Pentecost, Paul in all of the places that Paul talked. We have record of what they said. And in some cases, it seems like maybe it was a summary of what they said. But we have, again, another line of evidence as to what it was that they believed and what they taught. They said this. And as we said in the first couple of classes, what did they always talk about in their public sermons? It came full circle to what? We have to go back and look at our first packet. The resurrection. It always came back to, this man was raised from the dead and we are witnesses of that. And so that's another line. So we have Paul as a source. The Gospels are a source. Acts is a source. And there's also one more that's a little more obscure. But I'll give you a shot. So this is not in Scripture, but it's outside of Scripture and related to the history of the church. Can you guess where else might we find what the early disciples believed and taught in history? Any wild guesses? I mean, a lot of furrowed brows, which I half expected, but I want to bring this up so that we can be aware of it and think of it.
Well, Paul references traditions that they get passed down. So is it some sort of either traditions or recording of, the first century foundational beliefs?
Yes, but it's after they're gone.
You're talking about early church writings?
The early church writings, yeah.
Extra biblical writings by people who knew, in some cases, knew the apostles. Clement of Rome.
Yeah. So Clement of Rome is an important one, or you got, Irenaeus and Papias and all those. But what that is they were disciples after the apostles were gone who wrote and sent letters and sermons like the apostles did. And some of them knew the apostles directly. And so they repeat, this is, what they said, this was the character of their lives. It's actually been claimed that if we didn't have Scripture and we just had what the early church wrote, we could still have the whole totality of Scripture, just based on what they quoted and recorded. We still have the whole thing, even if the Bible somehow disappeared. And so that's another thing, is what the early church after the apostles said also. They're also saying this is what they said and this is what they did. Okay, so I just want us to be aware of that. I didn't put it on the paper because if you don't remember it, that's fine. But remember, what we're talking about here is possibly the earliest historical record that we have. This goes all the way back to the beginning. Remember some of those quotes, some people say this could have been, constructed by the apostles months after Jesus was crucified and raised. So that's why it's so important. But there are a lot of lines of evidence. And that is part of why everyone is so sure that this fact is true, because there's just so many different things claiming this. Okay. But the bottom line, what did they say? they claimed to see Jesus alive again. We said that's what the sermons always went back to. That's what they demonstrated with their lives. And what that is, we're going to connect that to the resurrection appearances that Paul specifically mentions. Because it's going back to somebody said, I saw Jesus alive again, and they got recorded in this tradition because they told other people about it. And that's the gist. Okay. I just want to check in because we talked about some odd things. Do we have any questions? Are things making sense? If they're not making sense, don't be embarrassed because it's probably not your fault. So do we have any questions? Okay. Speak now or forever hold your peace. Just kidding. You can ask me afterward. Okay, so number 1 at the bottom of page 1. So looking at this list of what we talked about, Paul seems to be listing this in chronological order. And what tells us that? Why does this seem to be chronological?
He says, first of all, to Cephas, and then.
Right, yeah, he repeats that. He says he first appeared to Cephas, and then he appeared to this person, and then he appeared to this group, and then he appeared to this group. So Paul's saying this is basically the chronological order that this happened. And so then we look at the particulars of the list. What does the fact that so many different people at different times within this same period, all claiming Jesus to be alive again, what does that suggest? That's true. We'll get into this a little bit. It doesn't prove that it's true. It proves that they believed it. Because people die and preach things all the time that they sincerely believe but that are not true. So it shows that they really believed it. But even backing up, what's something else that it might suggest? If you have all these different people saying something about this thing in the same period, Addie, what did you say?
I said that there's many eyewitnesses and that they can vouch for each other, and that Jesus was raised and remained for a period of time.
Okay. And so they're all testifying to the same thing, yes. And I'm thinking maybe my question is not clear here. Essentially what I was going for, Alicia, you may
I
end
was
this.
just gonna say, the fact that the different people at the different times, but not different people at the same time. So maybe that with his being risen, that it wasn't a ghost spirit, but that it was actually Jesus.
Yeah, that's something we will talk about in this fact. And that I hadn't thought about that, but yeah. Even just backing up from what Alicia said, where I'm going with this, and I think the problem's with my question, something happened. Something happened. If all of these people are saying this within the same period of time, something is going on, regardless of what in particular that is. And that's all really we're going at. If you have all these people saying something about these events, it at least means, at the base level, something happened. Does that make sense? I understand my question was not super clear. Okay, Andrew?
And maybe you could add to it a little bit. Something happened, and it wasn't just one momentary event.
Right.
Where people in the same place at the same time who are of the same persuasion could collude to make a story, but appearances in different ways, in different forms, in different locations over weeks of time is much harder to coordinate and make up.
Right. If you have just one situation and all these people are saying, oh, something happened, that's one thing. And you can say, sounds a little fishy maybe. But in different situations over different periods of time, different days, in different areas, seeing different things, okay, there's something going on here. If we have all of these different events happening. There's a pattern that's emerging. And that's really what we at least see is the fact that so many different people at different times within the same period claim to see something There was something happening. And that's one of the things that we can know. Something that's really interesting about this too. So we said Paul encounters Jesus on the road to Damascus probably about 3 to 4 years, something like that, after Jesus is crucified, depending on how you count it. But then after Paul, do we have record of anybody claiming to encounter the real risen Jesus?
Paul says he was born out of time, so there's almost a finality to that.
Okay.
But to answer the question, I'm not aware of any.
Right, and then there's not really. So you have this set period of time where all these people are saying, we're seeing him alive, we're seeing him alive, we're seeing him alive. And then it just stops. And nobody's like, oh yeah, me too, 12 years later. It's only with this original group of people. Because something was going on. And that's with people who study this professionally, even if they don't believe that the disciples were actually seeing Jesus, they're all unanimous in the fact that something was happening among these people. And the point is, how do we explain that? What were they seeing? What was this experience? But something happened with these original people within that few-year period. And then we don't hear about anything like that afterward. It's just not the same. And so that's an interesting thing to think about. We talked about this a little bit, but let's maybe restate it. At the top of page 2, so we said Paul is repeating this. He's repeating all these people's experiences. He's talking about his own. Considering Paul's background, why do you think it's significant that he is confidently stating these resurrection appearances in this record? Considering who Paul is and his background, why is it significant that he is so confidently stating these resurrection appearances?
When you look at the pedigree of Paul,
Okay.
Being where he was raised and how he was raised and all the education, the connection that he had, for him to be this confident and be able to lay this out, I feel there's some credibility to it because of his credibility in his teaching.
Because Paul wasn't stupid, is kind of what you're talking about. Paul wasn't stupid, and so he talks about this. And so that's part of it. What else, Taylor?
I said he had a lot to overcome. I specifically referenced in Acts 9:26. He says, and when Saul had come to Jerusalem, he tried to join the disciples, but they were all afraid of him. They did not believe he was a disciple. So he really had a lot to overcome with proving who he was. And if he's confident in that,
Right.
then overcoming that really shows something.
Yeah, so what did he do in overcoming all of that, like you're talking about?
Well, he spoke boldly. Barnabas took him in. Goes on to say he speaks boldly.
But yet he's interacting with them and he's preaching these things, and as we said, he's investigating it, right? So for one, Paul's not a dumb man, and everybody who knew him knew that. You can see that even in his trials. But also, he did not believe these things before. He thought that they were blaspheming God, that they were lying about what God had done, that they were claiming a false Messiah. And now, he's staking everything on this, saying this really happened. And that should cause us to step back for a second of, wow, this guy really changed his mind that way. Probably the biggest enemy of the church at the time. Then later comes to say, no, these things actually happened. These people really did see Jesus. And as we said, part of that was because he talked to them. So I want to take a second. Let's turn to Galatians 1. Because I just want to re-emphasize this. Okay, so Galatians 1, and we're remembering the context here. Starting in about verse 11, Paul's saying, what I taught you, I didn't come up with on my own. This is not some gospel from some guy, but I received this from Christ himself. And you know who I was and all of the things that I did. And so he gives kind of the chronology of his life. And looking at verse 17, this is in the middle of a thought. Well, let's start in 16. So it says that God was pleased to reveal his Son to me in order that I might preach him among the Gentiles, and I did not immediately consult with anyone. Nor did I go up to Jerusalem to those who were apostles before me, but I went away into Arabia or to Syria and returned again to Damascus. So why is Paul saying, I didn't talk to anyone, I didn't go to Jerusalem? What point is he proving here?
Maybe that he took some time to dwell on it instead of jumping headfirst into this conspiracy.
Okay, so that's one thing. Yeah, he takes time by himself. So for instance, in verse 18 it says, then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem, probably the first time. He's saying, I didn't get this message of Christ crucified and resurrected from anybody else but God. But then in verse 18 he says, then after 3 years I went up to Jerusalem to visit Cephas and remained with him 15 days. But I saw none of the other apostles except James, the Lord's brother. And he says, well, I'm writing to you as God is my witness, I'm not lying about this. So then what is he trying to prove when he says in verse 18 and 19 that he goes and talks to Cephas and James, and that was the only ones that he talked to? Is he still proving the same thing? Go ahead, Alicia.
Maybe proving the same thing, but also continuing the thought that he wasn't gathering the story to be able to repeat it accurately from everyone, but just that he was investigating it himself.
Okay.
With
Right. Yeah, so I think I'm going to try to restate some of what you said and connect it to what I'm thinking at least. So he says, I didn't get the gospel from anyone else. I got it from Christ himself. But then as he makes apparent in Galatians, he goes then and talks to the rest of the apostles in a way to compare notes. This is what I'm preaching. What are you guys preaching? And he says that elsewhere. And so he didn't get the gospel from him, but he's going to talk to them about their experiences and what they're teaching. And as he says elsewhere in the books, to make sure that I'm not laboring in vain, or I'm not wasting my time in what I'm doing. And as we said, and you can look at this a little bit some other time on your own, and not just take my word for it, but that word in verse 18, to visit, because we're just getting the sense of what Paul is laying out, we just have visit, become acquainted with, something like that. It's actually the word that we get history from. That's where we get the word history. And part of kind of the shade of it is he's going to visit and to get acquainted with and to not interrogate, but to question and to really get to know them and what it was that they were teaching and experiencing and those things. So as someone wrote once, when Paul goes to Jerusalem here to visit Cephas and James, it's safe to assume that they didn't spend their whole time talking about the weather. Paul is going back to the original disciples, and he's discussing with them, and again, comparing notes. And as we've argued, part of that, I believe, of what he walked away with was like the material that we have in 1 Corinthians 15, where he gets these traditions, and he hears from their own mouths what their experience was. So he hears from Peter what Peter's experience of the resurrection was. And he hears from James what James' experience of the resurrection was. And I don't think it's any coincidence that those two end up in the tradition. Somebody had their hand up. Andrew?
I was just going to comment, I don't think I'd ever really pieced that timeline together. That Paul waited 3 years, essentially 3 years of essentially self-study with Jesus.
Yeah, in some
Put it
way.
that way. Before talking to any of the other apostles. And, it leads you to think that, even though Paul saw Jesus on the road, he probably didn't flip a switch to trusting the apostles right away. And
Yeah, absolutely. And I think we're probably going to have to talk about some of these things in a future class. It's hard to understand how all of these events are fitting together, right? With Paul being converted, and then when does he talk to the disciples, and where do all these letters fit in? But yet, he does not go immediately and meet all of them. Elsewhere in Galatians, he says, the churches in Judea, they didn't see me. They only heard that the one who used to be persecuting us is now proclaiming the faith that he tried to destroy. And so, yeah, he's off by himself, doing the teaching and things like that. But he does go later, as I said, to compare notes, I think to get some of those traditions, to learn more of the background of the actual story that he was not there for. And that's a lot of what's going on. So I just wanted to emphasize that as we're talking about this. Not to take away, but to add to what we're talking about with question number 2 there. So then switching gears a little bit. So stay with me here and let's look at number 3. And we're referencing back in 1 Corinthians 15. Looking at this list, do you notice anyone that's missing in terms of the resurrection appearances? The women are not there. Okay, so we spent a lot of time on Sunday talking about how important the experiences and the testimony of the women were. Why do you think they weren't mentioned here in 1 Corinthians 15?
Do you think it's because their testimony would not be as credible in that period of time, that women were not as respected or thought as credible?
Yeah, that's absolutely true, that their testimony as women in that time would not be respected or thought credible. And so then what does that maybe say is the purpose of some of this material in 1 Corinthians 15? If you're using the most credible witnesses,
It's not all exclusive. All
what do you mean by that?
It's not necessarily every single person that Jesus saw the whole time.
Right, it's not. But it's kind of the highlights, the most important people, the most credible ones. And so part of this, then it shows that this was to be repeated and used to convince other people as well. Because the women are not mentioned here, even though they were, the primary witnesses, as we talked about. And so that's what we would have uncovered with question number 4. Who were the first witnesses? And the first witnesses to the resurrection were the women. And in particular, if you look at the accounts, Mary Magdalene was the first one to see Jesus alive again. And think about that for a while. But I can answer more questions about this after class or on Sunday if you have them. But we will begin talking about these appearances. We'll start with he appeared to Cephas on page 2. And be ready to go through, he appeared to more than 500 brothers at one time. So be prepared to get halfway through page 3. Okay, thank you.